So I'm going to say almost nothing so that you can see a little bit more of the film. I'm going to have to stop the film in about a third of the way through or so, 10, 15 minutes. And this is supposed to create a desire in you to order it from Amazon. You'll see the premise of the film is I interviewed a bunch of American Jews and asked them what they were told about Israel and the Middle East when they were young, and what they thought now, and how they got from one to the other. And a couple of astute people, when I've had other showings, have asked me, so what's your version of that story? And I thought, I don't know exactly what my version of that story is, but probably it has to do with Edward Said. That would be the tie-in. I think he was probably the first Palestinian I ever met. And I don't remember exactly how this process would have happened, but almost certainly his influence, which was actually crucial, although it's not in the film, for Tony Kushner. And it's mentioned as part of Judith Butler's experience, although not as an explanation for that particular turn. So I think, let's just say there are a lot of stories of conversion, or something like conversion, which Edward Said is involved in, and that could have been the subject of the film by itself. A couple of people, not everyone who was here this morning, would have said that they hesitated to accept the invitation to talk about Edward Said. I'm very glad that they finally gave in and did it afterwards. I have resisted and put the film in the place of an actual talk about Edward Said. But I probably have had an experience that not everyone has had, which is to have been told by Edward Said, there are these people out there who are trying to make careers on my coattails. You know, can you imagine that they're just writing about me and thinking, I at this point had written 5 times about him. What is he trying to tell me exactly? and 2 of those were by invitation of him, right? And he asked me, please do this. So it's a very vexed subject talking about him when I think about him. Anyway, all right, let's switch it to one.
I was never in any way critical of Israel. I believed completely that Israel was a small, valiant nation facing overwhelming odds.
I am not an activist, and I'm not an academic. I went largely without having a strong opinion, one way or the other. And I left having a pretty strong opinion.
I don't believe that music will save the world, and I don't believe that putting a Palestinian musician and an Israeli musician in a room and letting them jam is going to do anything, really.
And I remember not being able to sleep and feeling rage, doubt, fear, and then kind of getting it.
So I said, okay, let's start with the arguing here. And oops, that's probably my mother, who knows I'm doing this. Like I said, some of my best friends are Zionists.
I don't think it was.
To deal with hate mail, negativity from parents. The school has been beautifully supportive on the whole. The head of the school said, you teach them to read, write, and think, and you don't always like what they say. But they were very concerned about managing the reactions, so they called us in. The essay showed us how the difference in generational attitudes towards Israel, because for my parents' generation, Israel is the refuge from the Holocaust. And it's so sacred in that way. And for people my age and older, Israel was the socialist utopia, where you go to spend your summers working on the kibbutz and connect with the land, and you do folk dances under the moon. And then to realize that it meant something completely different to Jesse's generation was a real eye-opener.
When our school was asked to enter into this essay contest, and we were supposed to write about what occurred in the civil rights movement and tie King's ideas to experience that we had in our everyday lives. What I saw when I was told that we need to defend our race, I first heard that phrase, and what that immediately called to mind was the logic of the white South and the civil rights movement. You have people who are being abused because they are essentially getting in the way of an all-Jewish state.
It's so dangerous, I think, in American circles, to even be in front of this camera. It's so dangerous that it's the one thing, I can talk about anything else, but it feels like a foxman is around the corner, and that something bad will happen to you.
I brought some of Edward Said's home to my mother, who's a relatively intelligent and well-read person, and she became so angry at me that I remember her lifting up the dinner table where we are and throwing it against the wall. At which point I realized it wasn't going to be a conversation with me.
My wife says, "Your film is very important, my dear, but family is more important. Do not put your brother on camera, do not put your mother on camera. You can talk about how complicated it is, but don't actually endanger the loving relations you have with your family." And finally, that's what I decided.
I was born in Jerusalem, and lived in the Old City until I was 3. I came back to New York. My mother was from New York, and then grew up in New York City, and then we went back and forth. I had one friend in the class. It was a very brief period. I'll tell you why. I had one friend from the class, and it was actually the time when they said the only good Arab is a dead Arab, and they kind of sat and looked at me and said, "See what I said about that?" And I was just like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Like, I can't believe you just said that shit. And the teacher was there, and everyone was like dead silence. Everyone was just looking at me. Then we had recess. Came back, came into the class. The teacher locked the door from the outside, and they all beat me over the head with chairs. I was on the floor. They picked up a table, threw it at me, including my friend, who just stood there. He didn't hit me, but he stood there and watched.
I was visiting my grandfather in Massachusetts. He was in his 80s at the time. He said something sort of shocking to me, which was that he simply never could get his head around the project of Israel. He simply had never been able to understand what it was that had allowed that to be such a formative part of the identities of so many of his contemporaries.
You're supposed to support Israel blindly. That's how it's been sold to us. But this was sold to us by Ben-Gurion. This is not new. I mean, Ben-Gurion told us, we handle the government, we handle the politics, and you just support us and love us, which was fun for many years, until it became very critical, which it is today. I met Shula because I was forming a B'nai Brit Lodge in Binghamton, New York. And I needed a speaker. So I called the UJA and the Speakers Bureau, and I asked them if they could recommend us and get me a speaker for that night. They said, yes, I have a very good speaker. She's an Israeli. She'll be coming back from Israel about 2 weeks before your event. It should be very good for you. The topic I selected was femininity in the Israeli army, which was kind of catchy. And we had a great membership drive. And I went next weekend to meet Shula in New York, and we were married, I think, 5 months later. And that's how I really was introduced to Israel. I had no involvement or discourse about Israel before. Shula once spoke on the McNeil-Lehrer report. She was interviewed. And after that interview, our telephone started to tingle off the hook, bang, 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 every night. And who was it? It was the far, far right of the Jewish Defense League, people like that, who were calling. And what they were saying on the phone was unbelievable. I mean, four letter words that I hadn't used since I was 12. So finally I said, we have to turn this off some way. So one night they called, I picked up the phone, and I answered the phone, I said hello, and they started this diatribe of all this. And I started, Shema Israel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. They never called me.
In the last 20 years, I've been more Jewish than ever. Because I decided that all human beings must know human rights is a way of life. Meshuggah? Yes. Crazy? Yes. And I took it from my background, from my parents, from being Jewish, what it meant to be Jewish. This is why I go around the world and I preach human rights as a way of life, because Judaism is a way of life. Why did the Jews survive? Because they had a body of a framework of law and ethics. They were the people who always knew that without the other we don't exist. This is what we never did in Israel. We never moved our need to overcome the Holocaust, to overcome anti-Semitism, to overcome the fear of others.
The film is about how people have changed their minds. I asked everybody what they grew up thinking about Israel and the Middle East, and more or less what they think now, and how they got from point A to point B.
I grew up in a very happy, kind of creatively, progressively observant home. I was home for Shabbos every Friday night for dinner, no matter if I had, field hockey practice. I certainly was inculcated with an attachment to Israel, which I think I still have. And it was, kind of maybe like the feeling of having an exotic relative in, some distant place.
I grew up in a typical middle-class American Jewish household in the Boston suburbs. In my case, the Jewishness was minimal. My mother hated all religions, in particular the one she was brought up in. My father didn't care one way or the other. But I think I was very conscious of Jewishness, not as a religion, but as an ethnicity. Jews came to the United States and suffered discrimination as Jews, and they were sensitive to that. And many American Jews thought, hey, this is not a good thing. We shouldn't suffer it, and neither should Black Americans or any other group. And so it was that universalist aspect of Jewish culture that I identified with. You can react to the Holocaust by saying, never again will it happen to us. Or you can react by saying, never again should it happen to anyone.
My father was to this day, very pro-Israel. And pro-Israel doesn't even begin to describe it. Israel can do no wrong. And I was sentenced, I would say, to Hebrew school for 8 years for a crime I don't think I committed. Praying, thank you God for not making me a woman, etc. Posters or maps of the state of Israel that, of course, did not perfectly delineate the land known as Judea and Samaria. So I graduated not just very pro-Israeli views, but very anti-Arab views, I would say.
I came from a small town in the deep south. I was raised very proud of being Jewish. I was told by my parents from day one that if I was attacked or targeted in any way by anti-Semites, the problem was their problem, not my problem. There was no disguising or hiding the fact that we were Jewish. We were proud of being Jewish. Our community was proud of being Jewish. I was never in any way critical of Israel. I believed completely that Israel was a small, valiant nation, overwhelmingly, facing overwhelming odds and so on. I was horrified in the first, I think it was a contemporary civilization class. One of the students, who was a Jewish student, and my professor had a discussion about the state of Israel that was very critical. of Israel. And it's probably the first time I ever heard anybody really talk about Palestinians as opposed to Arabs. And it was a shock. I was furious about it. I wrote my professor a very angry letter, sort of saying, and I called my parents, and I was very, very upset by the whole thing. And it took a long time, and I would say probably 10 years.
I was born on the east side of Cleveland in a very large Jewish community. You know, my father would get anxious if somebody non-Jewish walked in the house. What's the last name? You know, what's the name? Well, who are they from? Are they Jewish? They're not Jewish? Maybe a little Jewish. If it was a little Jewish, it was better. A little Jewish, Jewish. So I didn't understand. There were two different messages I got. The Jews are only safe if they hang together. We belong to this community. These are the only safe people. On the other hand, we're in favor of civil rights. The blacks should never suffer like the Jews suffered. It wasn't until I was 20 years old that I stayed up all night arguing with a man who also came from my same part of town. He said that the state of Israel was not substantially different from apartheid South Africa. And my first response was to say, that's absolutely not true. And I was appalled, and I couldn't believe it because he came from the same place I did, and didn't even know. And in fact, we were both taught that the Nazi genocide against the Jews mandated the founding of the State of Israel as a sanctuary for the Jewish people. So if you started to call into question the mandate for the State of Israel, it seemed that you were insensitive to the plight of the Jews, that you underestimated anti-Semitism, that you didn't take seriously what the Nazis had actually done. So the idea that one might absolutely and unconditionally abhor the Nazi genocide, not only, by the way, against the Jews, but the communists, the gypsies, the disabled, and the rest, and object to the basis of the founding of the State of Israel, took a long time. It was as if to take that linkage apart was to cleave my own soul, was to literally come apart, to tear myself apart, to tear myself asunder.
The week.
You can get the rest of it on Amazon.
Yeah.